Shockley, longtime FileMaker developer. I got started in 1993 when I got to college, Drexel, with, was it FileMaker 2.1 or 3.0? I used them both, but I can't remember what I started with because, yeah. I've been using an AppleWorks database before college, the Apple IIe version, not the Mac version of AppleWorks. And that was on a Franklin Ace 500, one of those clone machines. They were the company that Apple sued, and it all went all the way to the Supreme Court and said that software can be copyrighted. Franklin tried to argue it couldn't. That was a brand new question. Anyway, so I did a lot of early web and FileMaker integration work in the late 90s and early 2000s. I went to law school, but I ended up back in tech, except for some volunteer work as a legal observer at protests in New York City. After 12 years working in-house for a big labor union in the city, I moved over to Jersey and I co-founded a small FileMaker consulting firm, Gotham DataWorks, with two other partners, Karen Stella and Chuck Edwards. Some of the New York folks probably know them, and maybe some of the other folks from different sessions and things online and conferences. In free time away from my computer, my wife and I love kayaking. We've got a couple of those kind of origami fold-up kayaks. Here, let me see. I got more pictures of the dogs, and I've got a picture of the kayak. So it's Tuck Tech, and these are fun. They're a really good bargain. You can get them from them brand new, under 500. You can get like refurbished. Anyway, I'm plugging something that I'm not selling, but we have a great time. You can unfold them, roll them up, tops a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them, the back seat of your car, which you don't need a roof rack and all that. So it's been great. That was up in the Adirondacks. So more dog photos. Here's Toby. There's Lydia really hoping she can eat one of the strawberries we picked. There's Toby on his bed. Dog's drinking from the water. Desktop background. What's this one? Toby after getting dried off from the rain. And my dogs like cucumber peels. She likes all kinds of fruits and vegetables, but this guy usually doesn't like vegetables, but he'll do cucumber peels. So, well, oh, you know, one of the previous presenters I saw said that Vince said he was a big proponent of backwards parking. Me too, especially after I watch people back out of driveways into busy traffic, and it always makes me nervous for them. So let's see. Let me open up the demo file. This is about FM clip tools. I'm going to go here and just, it's a little demo on how to use FM clip tools. If you haven't heard of it before, the basic idea is that FileMaker, when you copy lots of different kinds of objects in FileMaker, if you can copy something and paste it somewhere else, it's putting those objects into the clipboard. Well, it's putting them into the clipboard as a hexadecimal representation of XML. You can read that out, and now you've got text that you can do things with in a text editor or other tools that can manipulate text. That means that you can do all kinds of interesting things that are not necessarily provided directly in the main FileMaker developer interface. For example, you could do a search and replace in those objects and rename a variable in your script, and then you paste it back into the script, and all of the variables that you did the find and replace for have the new name. So that's the basic gist of it. It's a way to let you take a lot of these FileMaker objects, layout objects, field definitions, table definitions for that matter, scripts, script steps, themes now as well, value lists, and take them out, work with them in some kind of external tool, whether it's a text editor or other code, and then bring it back into FileMaker with your changes. So let's see. I could go right into showing how to use it, but I think I want to fire up just a little quick install because I don't have it on this machine yet. So I'm going to just show you this. We're going to go to the website. I'm going to the GitHub project. I'm going to do a very basic Git installation. If this doesn't work for us right now, hoping it will, this is on a fresh machine. So I'm going to CD to my code folder. Oh, no. I got to make the code folder. I forgot I started really fresh. We are going to clone. We're going to git clone this. And it says, oh, you don't have the Xcode developer tools. Well, luckily, this is just the command line stuff, not all of Xcode. So I'm going to agree to this. And it should pull that down. What GitHub lets you do is it lets you share code online and it lets people collaborate. And in this case, I've actually got some things where other people have done pull requests. And that's a way where they can say, hey, I've got an improvement suggestion to your project. And they can put in, here's my suggested code changes. I'm behind on some of those pull requests. Sorry, Matt Petrowski. It also lets people report bugs or other issues. Including yourself. You can go and put in here, I've got this issue and this thing I want to do, and you may create an issue for it. And it lets people update that software by just running a new command at the line, git pull, and you get the new version of the software. Let's see how this is doing. Finding software. Well, if we get stuck with the Git project, I'll give up on that and just download the zip file and do it that way. Give that another minute. Actually, we'll download this just so we have it just in case. Well, that's fast. Well, okay. Some of these VMs, I tried to do an update, and that's a bad idea. So we'll go with the non-Git flavored version of installing. So I downloaded FM Clip Tools. I've got this folder. I'm going to get rid of the name master. I'm going to go to my home folder where I made that folder called code. And we'll just drag that over. So we're done with the command line for now. Now, the installation process, if we're not going to do the Git, we did the quick and dirty with the zip file install. And then the next thing we want to do is set it up so that it's easy to summon. And there are a lot of useful third-party tools. I know a lot of people that use FM Clip Tools or other things like that will use something like Keyboard Maestro or Text Expander. Matt Petrowski has a thing where he used Better Touch Tool, where he lets them do certain gestures to invoke these kinds of commands. And I'm going to show the plain vanilla way of doing it, which is I'm going to open Script Editor. I'm going to open Script Editor in my VM, which is where I'm presenting from, not my main machine. And we're going to go to its preferences, and we're going to say, show the scripts menu in the menu bar. And that's it. We're done with Script Editor for now. You can go to here, open the scripts folder. Right now it's empty. If we go to the home folder where we have FM Clip Tools, there are a bunch of scripts in here. I'm going to select all the ones that say FM Clip, and I'm going to Command Option drag them to make aliases in the scripts folder. I'm doing that because I don't want to move them out of this project, because if I was using actual Git to maintain this, I'd want these files to stay here. But now you can see all these FM Clip commands in my Apple script menu in the menu bar. Okay, so we've done a very basic setup. Again, you could plug in and use useful things like Keyboard Maestro or Raycast or all those other kinds of third-party tools that let you execute scripts. First of all, before I move on, does anybody have questions about this installation process? Did they see anything that was weird or confusing, or, considering that the first thing I tried failed? If not, I will go on and we can take a look at some of the, here's the README file from the GitHub project. Just so you have the install process right here in this demo file. But here's a very simple conversion. We're going to take this FileMaker layout object, and we're going to do a search and replace in it and get a result. So I'm going to go and select this and copy it to the clipboard. I guess I should actually do it with the menu so you can see what I'm doing. Now, if I say, where is it? Replace string in FileMaker objects. Now this is a new VM, so it's like, is it going to allow you to do that? So you have to give the Mac OS access permission, like with so many things, but just the first time. We're going to search for first name, and notice we got a label and a field. And we're going to replace that with last name, because I know I've got a field called last name. And now I'm going to paste that right here. So what it did, it looked for everywhere in those FileMaker objects that there was a first name, and it changed it to last name. Okay, That's a lot of steps for a very simple, silly little thing. So let's go back to browse mode and go to the next thing. There's a much faster way to do the same thing. Oh, what did I do? Did I do it the slower way? I did. I did it the faster way on this demo. I was not reading my own instructions. Uh, so we've already done the next step, which is use the replace string in FileMaker objects. But let's go back and so you can see what I was actually going to show you here, which is the actual XML. If I copy that object and we say, change those FileMaker clipboard objects to XML, and then we go to BB edit, and we get a demo. Here's all the XML that's actually representing that label and that field. And there's a lot of information here. There's things about the layout and the bounding box. And there is a little thing here with the name of the field, the number of repetitions. There's a bunch of flags about like orientation and other things. But the important thing here is that we were going to, that you could just see that there's the first name field and there's the first name label. And so you could do a find and replace here, because you can actually make all those changes right here. And if you copy this and now say clipboard XML, because I just copied my modified XML to FileMaker objects, we come back to here and we paste, and there's our last name. Now I've already given you the punchline for the next tab, which is there's that replace string in FileMaker objects, which does all that find and replace for you without you needing to go over to BB edit and paste the XML and all that. Now, in our example, first name is pretty safe to search and replace for because it doesn't appear anywhere in the overall XML structure. But it's a good reason to note when you're running that find and replace, right? Like if I said that now, what's in here? Well, I already changed it to last name. So if I search for last name and it says there are 4 occurrences, I know there really are because the label gets 2 and the field gets 2 for various reasons. Okay, that's safe. I could actually search. In this case, I'm going to cancel. But what if it said like 15? Because my the thing that I was searching for was the word name. Well, that'd be a problem because sometimes certain things in the code, like theme name, certain things in the XML structure have that. So you wouldn't want to search for something that could be potentially be in the XML structure itself, because FM Clip Tools isn't carefully looking for things that aren't FileMaker's XML structure. They're saying search and replace in the text. So you want to be careful that that's another good reason to give your names of your objects longer or descriptive names. You wouldn't want to search for time format because you could break the objects and then they would not paste well. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Moving on, we've got, what if you had multiple search and replace? You can do them all in one shot. So let's see here. We've got this. I've got contact first name. In this case, I've changed the label. It's not just the name of the field. So I want something a little bit nicer. I'm going to say replace string of FileMaker objects. All right. And I'm going to say I want to search for a list. So I'm going to say first name, option return, contact first name. And I'm saying I'm searching for a list. Now it says enter your return delimited list of 2 replacement items. So last name, option return, contact, last name. So it's going to replace it's going to do both of those search and replaces. So I get contact last name label and last name field. Okay. Now, the nice thing to know is that you don't have to type in those option returns. Like if you had a bunch of search and replaces you wanted to do, you could have that list somewhere else. And once you've got this dialog open, you could have your list, say, over in BB edit. You could have like, oh, I want to change contact first name, and you could copy this and say search list and so on. And I'm going to cancel though. So that's the thing to note. That once you've invoked one of these, they've already looked at what's in the clipboard and they're ready to work with it. So you can now modify the clipboard once that dialog is open. Okay. Now, we're going to look at something where I'm going to get rid of these. They shouldn't already be there. Let's see. The clipboard in Mac OS can hold multiple types of objects all at the same time. When you paste them, the thing that you're pasting into asks the clipboard, well, what kinds of things do you have? And it picks the one it likes. Okay? So, for example, we can take advantage of that to put into the clipboard layout objects and script steps and text that is the name of the fields and so on. Let's say that you, I'm going to actually have all these on here. Let's say you have some fields on your layout and in my script, I'm going to want to set these 3 fields, right? So I'm going to copy these fields. So copy. And then I'm going to run the FM objects to multi-objects tool script here. And now I'm going to open up script workspace. We're going to go to a little playground script here, and I paste in, and I've got set field steps. The multi-objects thing just basically says, oh, you've got fields, so you might want to set field steps, and you might, if you were writing some documentation, you want the names of the fields, so it puts those in there. And if you went into some random table, I'm going to just do this temporarily, and we won't save our changes. And I can paste those fields. So it put in there field definition objects, set field script steps, the original objects, and the names of the fields. This is kind of nice because you could do the opposite. You could say copy from here, say clip objects to multi-objects, and then you can paste, I'm going to discard in this case, and then you can paste those fields you just copied from managed database, and you can paste them onto the layout. Nowadays, the layout interface has lots of nice things that you can do to quickly add fields, but it was a nice thing at the time, and it still is useful for being able to go between different types of objects. Anyway, and the reverse works here as well. You could say, copy these things, and then say FM objects to multi-objects. And now I copied those names of fields, and I can paste set fields. So if you've got a list of names of fields over in some text editor or some other tool where you are planning things, you can copy these, say FM objects to multi-objects, and then go into some here and paste in new fields. So it's a way you could also create a bunch of fields quickly, as long as they're text. I didn't have a thing where you can define the whether it's a number or a text field in that multi-object script, although it's something you could set up with FM clip tools. Okay, let's see. Back to browse mode so we can go to the next. Now this is an interesting thing. Replicating FileMaker objects. For example, you've got a block of script steps that you need very similar versions of. You could copy them and do a replace string, but what if you wanted to find 5 copies of it? It's a bunch of find and replace. Okay. So what we're going to do is go into, let's see, where's my sample scripts to replicate script steps? So I've got, let's say I've got this. I've got some JSON, and it's got the first name, last name, phone work, blah, blah, blah. And I want to set the fields to all those if they aren't already that value. So I did that for first name. Get the new value out of the JSON, first name. If the demo first name is not equal to new value, then set the field. Okay, great. But I've got that for a whole bunch of these fields, not just first name. So I can go to this replicate script. And now it's asking me, okay, well, what's the items you want? Well, I've already got first name, so I'm going to copy all these other things. And I'm pasting them in here. And unfortunately, with these AppleScript dialogues, they're one line only, but they actually work with multiple lines, but you can't see unless I scroll through it. They're all there. I say replicate. And it's okay. Well, here's your original object. What's the piece that you want to have get replaced with the word last name? Well, everything, it's just first name. That's the thing I want to have replaced and replicated. So it goes and does that. Now I go down here and I say paste. Now I've got last name, phone work, phone home, and the fields, and email, and date of birth, all the way through. That's a neat little thing that you can do with replicate. it does more than that. And I'll show you that in a second here. Button bars. Okay. We all know that when you want to set up a button bar with a lot of segments, and all the segments are pretty similar. You have to go and hit the plus button and add another one and modify the script parameters, the label, the hide conditions, maybe conditional formatting, the names of the objects. Well, replicate also works with not just single column list of items. Like I showed you on the previous example, last name, phone work, date of birth. It can do delimited data. So you can have multiple columns of replacements that happen. So here, I'm going to copy this one button bar, and I've got this set up. It's sample one. Its script parameter is sample with the number one. Its segment, its object name is sample one. And the little tooltip says this will run the sample one spelled out word actions. And does it even have, it has hide conditions. It says if sample one's in the global variable that says hide this segment, we want this segment to hide. Okay, this button bar has a lot of stuff set up on this segment. I'd be really annoyed if I had to hit plus and do all that again for these other 4 segments I want, because I'm lazy that way. So I'm going to copy this segment. Oops. I'm going to run the replicate tool here. Now it notices, wait a minute, you've got a button bar object. Do you want to just make a bunch of copies of that button bar object and they'd be all separate, or do you want to do them as segments? Well, I want segments. I'm going to bring this over here. Here's what I want to convert that to. I got to switch to browse mode so I can click this. It just put all that in the clipboard. I'm going to paste. So here's all the things it's doing in the clipboard. That you can't see here. If I paste it over in BB Edit, you can see it's there's a tab, especially if I show invisible characters. There's a tab. So this is tab delimited data. I guess if I had done this with a spreadsheet, you'd be able to see that it's delimited data more easily. Now I'm going to say replicate. It's like, okay, where's the placeholder for column 1, which is sample 1? Well, the good news here is it's sample 1 because I want to create the button bar with my original one as well. So I'm going to say next. Okay, what's the thing that should become sample 1? So in all that, it's this. Everywhere that the word sample 1 appeared, we want to see these other items. Well, sample 1, put it back in, because I want that in my final button bar. And testing 2, more stuff 3, still more 4. I hit replicate. I go, okay. I come in here in a layout mode and I paste. And now I've got this button bar with all just from this delimited data and testing 2. And its script parameter is testing with the numeral 2. And it's got the thing where it says, if the segment hide list has testing 2, then do that. And I guess I should have actually used their object names, but oh well. If we go back to browse mode now, you can click these. They each call a script that just announces what their parameter was. More stuff 3, and so on and so forth. So when I added this to FM Clip Tools, I was really happy because it made it a lot easier for me to put together nice button bars that did complicated stuff and only have to do one segment at a time. Or not have to do each segment. So I'm not hearing any feedback yet. Is this working well so far for folks? Is there anything where somebody thinks that they want to have some questions about it?
You have some questions in the chat. Eric, you want me to pick one out? David Head said field label names are often not the same as field names.
It depends on if you're following a naming convention, right? Maybe they should be the same according to some naming conventions.
David's coming online to flesh it out. What do you got, David?
Sure.
I think David just unmuted, but maybe I saw
that.
Yeah,
there he goes.
It comes back to just, obviously then you went on to demo that, and it's one of those things where you're going to have to do multiple things to change the things that you want. So that's the way it is, I suppose.
Yeah.
Hey, let me jump in and riff on that. Dan, I thought it was very interesting where you're laid out just a moment ago the perils of naming your fields with names that also exist in the XML. In a minute, as soon as I find it, I'm going to drop a link to a little snippet presentation by Vince Venano, where he pointed out that if your field name is the same as like a field label or even just a text string that's nearby, and you change the field, it'll change the text. It's a little bit of a gotcha.
Yep, I've seen that where it's a certain radius around the thing.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to stop the sharing just for a second so I can tell this VM not to try to log into my iCloud account. I hope that doesn't mess up the recording.
It makes it feel live.
Not fine. We just see more faces.
Then
I had another question though. What's the worst case scenario in making edits on that XML and pasting it in?
I don't know. I haven't thoroughly tried out like seeing what happens if I believe if you put in invalid XML, it won't paste. But I haven't really experimented with that recently. So
I've never seen it break.
Well, there you go. Tony says it's safe.
I mean, it'll if you give it like incorrect XML, I've never seen it like corrupt a file or anything like that. I think the super talented programmers over at Claris FileMaker have a little XML vetting. That'd be a good question for Clay at the upcoming conference, Full Access. But I think it's safe, and also just get it correct, right, Dan? You know, your code is just writing the text correctly, so do that.
Yeah. All right, let me jump back in with this. I think I got that.
David had. Can I do one more? David had one more question about what about the right TO, and that's your final question, I think. If you want to
field options pasted to the TO name, yeah. You can search and replace and change the TO name if you want to. When I paste it into the field definitions, one of the interesting things that FileMaker does is if you copy from one table and paste into another, it doesn't care that you said, oh, the definition says demo. If you pick it to a different table and you say paste, it happily pastes the names of like the fields and just says, oh, well, you said in the clipboard that they were from the demo table, but I'm pasting them here. Fine. It doesn't care.
Yeah, but what happens when you copy a field out of a portal and it's got a particular TO name attached?
Out of a portal. Oh, well, that's an interesting thing where this is also really useful. If you've got, and I don't have a demo of this, so I'll just have to explain it. If you've got a portal, well, I guess I have a portal on here. Let's say that I have this nav layouts portal, and the base table occurrence behind this relationship, this base table behind this is the same table. You can copy this portal, and you can find and replace, for example, nav layouts with nav layouts 2 or whatever your other relationship is, and then paste. And now you've got a copy of the portal using a different relationship to a different table occurrence, which is often a really handy thing to do. Does that kind of fit in with your question, or am I missing the question?
Yeah, no, that's basically probably nailed it. I would just have to play around with it and see what my use cases were with different table occurrences.
Yeah, like let me just show you this. I just copied that portal, right? One of the interesting things is that layout objects, their XML is nicely formatted, unlike the other ones have it all blocked together. This one's a little bit pretty. Although it's not indented, it has them all as separate lines. I'll show you some of the raw stuff from other types of objects a little bit later. That's interesting. Yeah.
So you'd be changing that one up the top as well in that case if you replace nav layouts. What's that table alias key?
So so there's a couple different pieces here, right? There's the table alias key, right? And then there's the calculation for like the script here, go to layout by name. So if I was going to do a find and replace and I wanted to change to use from one portal to another that was nav layouts 2, I would not search for nav layouts : because that would only change the fields or references to fields. I want to change everything, right? So sometimes looking at the XML can be helpful so that you kind of get an idea of what you're changing. But it can also, there's a lot of stuff in here. If you can look at things, there's stuff about, is the field rotated or not, right? There's a lot of different things. There's flags. This is one of those tricks where it's essentially a representation of a binary value where it's like 1 means this flag, 2 means this flag, 4 means this flag, so that you can never have, so a number can always be decomposed into its binary bits of what these different flags are. So this is probably 65,000. I don't remember what I used to know the multiples powers of 2, and I don't remember that one anymore.
16 or something like that?
Yeah, it's like 16,384, 13,786.
Oh, 256. Yeah.
It's multiple flags composed, and like you said, Dan,
yes,
you can
add it and then added together.
Yeah.
Well, let me come back to here. We have more questions, or should I move on to the next demo?
I think you got to
move on for now. People can jump in if they want to say something else. I'm okay with being interrupted. So, okay. One of the things that's really nice that FileMaker lets you do is if you've constructed some kind of find request and you've got a bunch of fields, maybe you've got multiple requests, maybe some of them are omit requests, you can go into your scripts workspace and you can go into here and you can say perform find and just tell it, restore. Now in this case, I didn't just do a find, so there's nothing to save here, but you can go and save it, right? And that's great. This is Bob Smith, and he wasn't born before 1980. You can look in here. There it is. Bob Smith, date of birth, 1970. Oh, my bad. Let's fix the documentation while we're in here. But that makes it these kind of canned, I call them canned perform finds. They're really useful, but you can't see what they're doing without looking into them. So I wrote a little thing that uses some of the stuff in FM Clip Tools where I'm going to copy this. You can't right click. Okay, we'll do it from here. And I'm going to say, turn a perform find into separate script steps. And it actually is going to do the paste for me once this VM allows it. This is the downside of demoing on a raw machine. I hadn't already set up all the permissions for things. Okay, let's go back over to here and try again. And it pastes them in. Now it gives you a little warning. So notice what it does. Enter find mode, set first name to Bob, last name to Smith, make a new request, omit, date of birth, less than. Notice it has double checked this because the perform find is not structured the same way as these. These are not FileMaker calculation boxes in here. They're kind of like something special. And to do that and to convert that, all I can do is convert the text. Now, at some point, notice that the actual XML from that perform find step has the date in this format, not in the FileMaker format. That's a change. That wasn't true like 10 years ago. So as you can see, we definitely would want to change this. We want to change this to 1/1/1970. And now that's going to do what we intend. I wouldn't actually do it this way if I was, just for the record, if anybody's looking at this and saying that's bad FileMaker, of course I would do, I would do it like this. We all know, but with good spacing. But anyway, you get the idea. So it's a nice little extra tool that I added I had a lot of stuff in the solution I was working with at the time where users had some power users had created a lot of these kind of canned finds, and I wanted to be able to see them this way so I can see what they do without opening them up. Kind of the opposite of the code folding that they added in the newest version of FileMaker. I wanted to be able to unfold the code. So let's go down here, back to Yeah, notice I have. Read the pasted warning comment and make sure you fix anything. This example, I don't know if you noticed, it actually pasted it in for me. That's because if we go to this, we open up the perform find script, it actually does some pasting, which is why that I got that system events, the permission yelling at me, because it's trying to do a keystroke V using command down. And Mac OS is a lot more protective of any automation stuff potentially being bad for you than it used to be. Once you've got that set up on your machine, you won't have to see that dialogue every time. Okay, so now we can go to custom functions. They also are XML. I don't remember if I mentioned them at the beginning, but sometimes you've got a source file that has lots of good custom functions, and you've got some new file you're working in, and it has few or no custom functions, and you want to select one or more of them. Well, if we go to this is the custom functions I'm going to want to copy. I'm just copying this right now to put this in my clipboard. I'm going to go to Manage, Custom Functions, and I'm going to say, well, I've got more than those. And I don't want all of them. I don't want everything in here for my new file. So I'm going to say Copy Specific Custom Functions. I can tell it, here's my list. I'm pasting in the list of the 4 that I want. And I say Copy. It goes and selects all, and it puts it in the clipboard, and now it's yelling at me, unable to copy existing functions. I wonder if this is one of those security things. Let's try it this way. So I'm going to pretend that I ran that from the menu, but I'm going to do it from here instead, from script editor. All right. That's my list. Say copy. And script editor is now yelling that 4 functions were copied to your clipboard, so you can now paste into a target file. Okay, great. Thanks for that, script editor. In this case, I'm going to paste into this file because I don't have a second file, and so you're going to see all those functions with a 2 at the end, but you get the idea. It was able to copy just those 4 instead of this entire list of 13 custom functions. Okay. There's another similar script, but sometimes you want to copy a bunch from one file, and maybe you just want to be able to copy all of them from your template file and paste them into some file that already has some of your template custom functions. So we've got another useful little thing in here called paste as needed. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to contrive an example here. We're going to manage custom functions. And we're going to come over to here. You can see so I can see my instructions, so I make sure I'm following what this demo actually is. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and these fake functions. I'm going to copy those. And now I'm going to delete a couple of these. Let's say I've got this file that only had fake function 5, or I guess I should have said 1, but anyway, it doesn't have all the functions I just copied. It does have trim.ws, but doesn't have the first 4 fake functions. I'm going to say custom function paste as needed. Again, this is checking, and it went and it copied and it checked this file. Which functions do you have? And then it modified the custom functions it had in the clipboard to only the 4 that didn't already exist here. Okay. So that's, if you noticed, it briefly went and selected all because it was copying them so it could see what does this file have. Okay. Now we're going to do another similar thing, but what if it has some of the custom functions, but they're outdated versions? So there's a custom function paste or update. And we're going to do that. I'm going to do a similar thing to last time. I am going to copy trim.ws and all of these, and we're going to say copy. And now I'm going to delete those, and then fake function 3 and say this is the outdated version. Okay, so now we're pretending I'm in file number 2, the file that is missing fake function 1 and 2, and it has this old bad version of fake function 3. So I'm going to say paste or update. It's going to first paste in the 2 that it needed to paste in, and then it's going to tell you, hey, fake function 3 already exists, but it's different than what you had from your source. It says by default, they'll all be updated, but it's going to show you a list, and this is an AppleScript list. So it would be, there'd be a list here, and I'd be able to deselect ones that I don't want to have it run. In this case, I'm going to say update. It's going to open up fake function 3, and so it reports at the end, it pasted 2 functions and updated 1 functions. Oh, 1 functions. You see that? It said 1 functions. I'm sorry. That's bad programming. I should have had it say 1 function. Notice it brought back to the original good version of fake function 3, not the outdated version. Okay. So that's a really useful thing when you're managing a bunch of custom functions across different files, and you've got a good source file that has the current versions of all your custom functions. You can easily update. I don't think it handles if you've changed the number of parameters. It's been a while since I've had that because, I try not to do that because that actually causes, you have to actually reprogram things in the target file if you change the number of parameters. I'm going to not save any of those little contrived scenario changes I made. Okay, so that's the paste or update custom functions thing. Now, this is another interesting little thing, which is there's a lot of great comparison tools out there. I mean, FM perception, you've got FM comparison, you've got the base element stuff, you've got Inspector Pro, you've got all these wonderful tools for comparing FileMaker files in pretty involved and very useful ways. Sometimes I wanted to do like a quick and dirty comparison. In my scenario, it was literally, I had a dev version of a layout in a live file because I was letting the customer toggle between what I was building and the normal layout that they're using for everybody else. And so at some point, I had that and I looked at the dev one and I was like, I think there's nothing left here that I didn't move to live. I don't think I had any like leftover stuff I wasn't done building. So I was going to replace it with the stuff from the live layout. But then I thought, well, what if there isn't? What if there's something different? So I'm going to make a new window here. And I'm going to go to my sample layouts. I guess I'm going to have to do it this way, manage layouts. Sample, comparison, dev, and production. I'm going to open these both up. And I'm going to go to layout mode. And notice the production one has just these 2 labels and these 2 fields. The dev one has this tiny note here. Okay, interesting. So now I'm going to say, let's compare these 2 layouts and using BBEdit. Now this really does call just bare bones software as BBEdit. You could rewrite this to call some other text editor. I know a lot of people like Sublime. I'm a big BBEdit fan, have been for a number of decades. And now that it's free, it's even better. Are you kidding me? The vagaries of working on a demo machine. Let me try one more time. Something's going on where it can't write to this path. All right, well, I'll do it the slow way. Copy this. Clipboard objects to XML. Make a new window here. A new file in BBEdit. Select all copy. FileMaker objects to XML. Over here, paste. And now I'm going to say find differences. Compare the 2 front windows. Now it's going to tell me that there's something different here. At the top, it's just because of the way it was copied. It says the enclosing rectangle is a little different. You can see these differences. It's just the coordinates. And then there's extra lines. In the production one, there's this thing that says tiny text. Where is it? It's hard to see with this purple highlighting. Tiny note here. So, and then there's all this XML stuff around that. So these 2 layouts, as I could see, since they're very simple, were different. It showed me that there's some differences. That script's a lot more useful if you run it and it works on your machine, unlike this virtual machine I'm running in right now. That shows how that works. Let's go to the next example. Loop script steps. This is an example of using the clip tools to save little code snippets. Now, once you've got FileMaker objects and they're in a FileMaker file, you can only store them in another FileMaker file as FileMaker objects. But when you convert them to text, you can store text almost anywhere, right? So I'm going to go into a little sample scraps playground here. We're going to delete these things from before. And I'm going to run a little thing. And this is just something that's like, I added it because I added loops to scripts so often that I wanted a little snippet that was easily accessible. But you could add snippets another way. And I've actually got a pull request on a GitHub project from Matt Petrowski to add snippets to FM Clip Tools so that you can have a nice little folder of them. And I hope to do that at some point. In my case, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to loop over a bunch of records. So I'm going to just say records. And I'm going to have to do the paste step because of whatever that permissions issue. So it would have pasted it in for me. I had to paste, full disclosure. And this is just a nice little like loop over all the records in the found set and complete with a little refresh window, except if you're on the server every 20 records or at the beginning, at the end with 1/100th of a second pause. And then, do whatever you're going to do with modify your records. Oh, modify. Whatever you're going to do with these records. Okay. And that's simple little loop script. The same thing that I found really useful is a nice little thing of, if I was going to loop over a bunch of IDs, I'm going to say, ID, it could be noun. Whoop. I'm going to say loop over list, my nouns list. If I had a variable that had a bunch of return delimited nouns. And again, I have to do the paste. Then all it does is make a nice little loop script for you where it pulls each item out of the list and you could do something with it. So that's just an example of doing like a little snippet with a script that's got it built into the script. Again, you could store snippets as text files anywhere and then open them up, replace in them, and then convert them from XML to FileMaker objects to paste them into FileMaker. Now, looking at XML code, a lot of these things are not super pretty. Like just looking at a little bit of script steps here. I'm going to copy this. I used to automatically have FM Clip Tools prettify, or it uses a command that's built into the Mac OS. It's open source called tidy, and that neatens up the XML, indents it nicely, so it's easier to read. But I ran into some situations with really large blocks of XML where tidy would make slight modifications that caused problems, where it didn't paste into FileMaker anymore because it was no longer following the particular way. It was still valid XML, but it wasn't the Claris specific FileMaker version of the XML. And so it didn't paste properly. So, or I think didn't paste at all, as Tony was saying. I'm going to go in here and paste what I copied. So here's this XML. Now, this little calculation in the middle is fine, but notice we got the step and some text. And if I soft wrap the text here so you can see the whole thing, it's kind of hard to read. So one of the things I added just to make it easier, now, your text editor probably has a tidy command, like right here. BBEdit could do this, but if maybe you weren't using BBEdit, I've got a simple prettify XML and clipboard. And then if you paste, now you've got some nice, easier to read XML. And if you're in something like BBEdit and you tell it this is XML, either by picking that or saving it, you get some nice syntax highlighting. And that's that. If we go to the next tab, we've got another thing that's interesting is that we've got I made a little custom function that uses a base elements plugin to do the same thing that FileMaker Clip Tool, FM Clip Tools does, converting XML to objects. So if I copy this XML, click on this, now I've got a bunch of XML on my clipboard for layout objects, okay? And then I'm going to run this convert button, and all that this does, if you look at this convert button, is a single step that just says run this custom function. I do that, go back to layout mode, I can paste, whoop, demo button. And that's what this XML was doing. And it's just, hi, this is a demo button. Good job. I'll show you that custom function so you can kind of get an idea of what it's doing. We go to here, clipboard, XML, the FM objects. That is just like this in FM Clip Tools, but it's built right into FileMaker as long as you have the base elements plugin, which is a great open source free plugin. And I'm getting the little FileMaker thing where it's slid off to the side a little bit there, but here we go. It just looks in the clipboard. Is there XML representation of FileMaker objects? Convert to those objects. It's a little bit naive or trusting. If the beginning of the text in the clipboard looks like it's XML that's FileMaker objects, in other words, it begins with you know, the XML snippets or a thing. If it begins with any of these kinds of things, then it says, oh, I trust that that's FileMaker XML, and it will try to convert it. So obviously you only do this if you trust the XML you put in the clipboard. Let's see. And it just goes through and it reads out and it looks for the beginning of the XML. It checks for the different types of things. And this actually will work on Windows as well, last I checked. Because the base elements plugin is actually able to convert the objects to work with Windows as well. And scrolling this a little bit slow here. Let's get the output clipboard type. And for Windows, it's got these. It's interesting. The Windows clipboard types for these FileMaker objects is Mac XMTB for tables. It's Mac XMFN. It's interesting. That's what went with the Windows version of FileMaker Pro. You call the clipboard objects those names. So that's this custom function, and that's in this demo file. So if you could grab that, and I added that partially, and the reason I wanted to work for Windows is FM Clip Tools is AppleScript based, which means you can't run it on Windows. But every now and then, if I was doing some development work on a Windows machine and I had I had some FileMaker object on my machine that I wanted to get into this Windows machine, and transferring a FileMaker file and copying from it was not really an option, I could copy the object on my Mac, convert it to text, come over to the Windows file, and if I had this custom function, convert that block of text that came through the clipboard sharing into pastable FileMaker objects. So let's remove our demo button. Hey, bye to Alexi. And I see people saying this tool is Mac only. Yes, at least for now. I have thought before about building it into a FileMaker database, because a lot of what it does could be done directly in FileMaker as long as you have the base elements plugin. You saw that I have just a custom function that does the one direction. To do the other way, I'd have to reverse it, which is doable. I just haven't gotten around to it. I've got a bunch of useful links. Here's FM Clip Tools. The third-party utility I use to run my scripts when I'm not on a demo machine and doing it directly from this menu is Keyboard Maestro. I've got keyboard shortcuts to do a bunch of these conversions. BB Edit. A lot of people use Raycast for a lot of development things, and Eric Lusso, Proof Plus Geist, did a extension for Raycast called FileMaker Snippets, and it uses FM Clip Tools behind the scenes to do the translation between objects. And I've looked at Raycast a little bit, and I feel like I want to learn it, and I haven't had the time yet. So as far as I can tell, it looks like a great tool, and so I linked to that here. I've got my fly cut in the menu here. It's for clipboard history. Nice little free open source clipboard utility. You can get it from the App Store, or you can get it right from their GitHub project directly. Got a link to base elements. Source Code Pro is a really great font. I don't know if you've noticed in BB Edit, that was my font. I'm a big fan of things being easy to read. My terminal as well. Um, and then Matt Petrowski did a great video about using Better Touch Tool as the utility with which to summon all these little scripts. And this demo file is on the GitHub page. So right at the top here, github.com/danshockley/fmcliptools. I almost forgot and then realized today I didn't have the demo file on the project, but now here it is. It's in the project. You can get that. It shows you how to use it, including a bunch of examples that we just went through. Let's see. That's through all of the little slides or layouts that were in this FileMaker file. I don't think I had any extra playground things. There's some little behind the scenes stuff. This is a pretty basic file. I didn't have all my normal templates in it. But there are other topics we could dig into some more of these examples, and if people have more questions about how to do these, or if you have some scenarios where you'd want to try something out, we could do that. There is also a possibility we could talk about some of the user interface scripting. I mean, I mentioned, of course, on my VM here that was failing. It worked for one of them, pasting something, but it didn't work for others. Like that should be pasting, and it didn't. And I'd have to figure out why that is. But if anybody has more questions, we could do that first.
Dan, there's some comments and questions. Dave Simpson points out that it is indeed possible to crash FileMaker with malformed layout XML. So be forewarned and don't
do that.
Don't do that. Exactly. David Head's got some questions. David, feel free to unmute and jump in. I don't want to misquote you.
Yeah, I thought the demo with the perform fine was useful to be able to in inverted commas correct other people's code. But I'm not understanding that selected custom function paste thing. If you use the native function to be able to import custom functions from one file to the other, I think that's probably a better UI than what you're doing there.
I think that's true. The example here, let me go back to this. I think you're not wrong about that. It's a really useful way of doing things where you can pick and choose. I did not use this very often for whatever reason. Let me see what's in this custom functions in here. Oh, none. Okay. But I know what you're saying. It lets you pick and choose. So I guess for the adding a specific list, that's not, it's not much of an issue. For the example of the kind of paste as needed, you don't have to know which ones you need to not pick because they're already here. And in my example file, I've got 13 custom functions. I've worked on solutions where there's 100+ custom functions, and it becomes a lot of effort to go and pick and choose. This file has 110, and my template file has 130. Which of those 20 are new? Which of them are old in the file I'm trying to get them into? So that's why I built those. So like you said, if the import thing does what you need, then great. There's no reason to do anything extra. Yeah,
certainly. I think we just need to be careful of missing native functions. And
absolutely.
I simply do a copy and paste between files with custom functions. So I'll go through and cherry pick the custom functions I want out of this file, go into the other file and basically paste them in. And if some of them come up with the 2 at the end of them, then that tells me that they already existed, so I can have a look at it and see which ones I need to. But I think that's be able to update it on the fly.
Yeah, one thing that's unfortunate about that is when you've got interdependent custom functions, and one of the dependencies is in the target, then the one that you pasted that was brand new is going to call the one that was a duplicate that has a 2. So then you have to go and find that and update it to use the one that was already there. So you're right, but that in my use case. This was, I was working at a place where we had a lot of files. And we had a lot of custom functions. And this was like one useful little piece of a much larger tool that I don't know if it still works, which is basically a crawl through this file and update all these standard things. And it did a lot of UI scripting. It would open up manage custom functions. It would open up things. It would go into function parameters and rename function parameters. And it would open up script workspace and paste in standard scripts that weren't there. It would open up a script and it would highlight everything and add script steps. And it did a lot of UI scripting. It was very involved. And as you can imagine, it was fragile because UI scripting is, user interface scripting. There's so many things where it's like one little change, and like, let's say that Claris goes and adds something to improve the script workspace a little bit. So now this is not scroll area 3 of group 2 of window section 5 of window 1. It's now group 3 with scroll area 2. Your user interface scripting just breaks. So I'm assuming that the tool that they had no longer works.
Yeah.
So I tried it with FM Clip Tools. I tried to keep any UI scripting to a very basic minimum. Things like, do a Command V.
Yeah. Just on a side note, I note that in FileMaker 2025, we've now got folders for custom functions now.
Yeah, I think that works with FM Clip Tools. I sometimes, well, yeah, that I know a lot of people will be very happy for the organization that will enable. I like using leading names. Yeah, personally, that was just my favorite way of organizing things, especially since the folders don't actually create a namespace. So you still need to have unique names, and I'd still like to group them together this way. Even if I use folders, I think I would keep matching prefixes to group things. Yeah.
My final question there was just if we were to use this tool, I see, and I appreciate that you set up a bare bones sort of machine to demo this on. So do you have a list of all the sort of permissions that we need to set to make this work properly?
It's mostly, obviously something's a little bit off with this virtual machine, and I think that might, its nature might be the issue, and the fact that it's running out of space or something. It was being weird for me. It's you need to allow it to interact with FileMaker. It basically needs to be allowed to automate FileMaker, and that should be under privacy and security, automation. There it is. Oh, maybe that's my problem. Oh, well, system events. Well, anyway, it says it's turned on. So it should have been able to do it, but maybe something's going on with FileMaker. I wish I could search these to find the option. On a normal Mac, I think it's pretty easy to, the first time you get it, you'll prove it, and then it'll work from then on.
Right.
I think the VM is behaving strangely for me. Let's see. And I see Rick saying that with, he's writing stuff about XML 2.0 work in the chat. And that was one of the things I thought might be an interesting conversation, is that Claris is doing some really interesting, powerful stuff with XML. Right now, you've got these slightly different formats, right? Like the format of the objects and the clipboard is not the same thing as a DDR. It's not the same thing as save a copy as XML. I would love to, I think it's great that they're pushing forward on that. They clearly are trying to build a really great XML structure where I assume that the Holy Grail is being able to create a FileMaker file by creating XML and then saying, now turn this into a FileMaker file. And that would allow all kinds of interesting things, especially when you consider things like the patch tool and other things where you could say, add these objects from XML or essentially into a FileMaker file. Also, on the note about the clipboard XML, I would love to see copy and paste supported in a few more places. The relationship graph currently you can't copy in the relationship graph. It would be nice if and I guess we switch to night mode here. It would be great if we could copy these table occurrences and maybe even relationships. I don't know how, I'm not sure how that would work actually. So I'm not going to ask for something I can't even say how it should work. But maybe if you had table occurrences connected and you copied them to another file, it'd be nice if the connections came as well.
Even just to be able to read those strings would be good.
Yeah, that's true. But if you had copy paste, you could do a search and replace and make, if you had some kind of structure, some kind of table grouping, you could make a different version of it with a search and replace. So I'd love to see copy and paste support everywhere. I feel it's not just great for, it's great for everybody. It's also an accessibility thing. The relationship graph is one area that if you look at UI scripting, you can't do any UI scripting in this scrollable area in the middle because this is a black box. So anybody who uses the accessibility tools built into Mac OS to do their FileMaker development essentially cannot work with the relationship graph. I'd love to see that improved and actually have it be accessible to people who have screen readers and things like that, because there's so much great accessibility stuff in FileMaker. I mean, you've even got the accessibility inspector, where you can actually give the voiceover names to your FileMaker objects if you're a developer who is trying to be conscientious about accessibility. Apparently, I'm not being conscientious about accessibility in this instance, this demo file. I haven't done any of that yet. I will put that on my list. But let's see. Yeah, there's.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
I'm going to join you in a respectful request for more, please, as they say. I think FileMaker's done a terrific job. I think it's one of the best features of the FileMaker platform, all the code objects that have already been shipped and delivered, including custom menus. If I was going to vote for the next one on the list, I would vote for layouts. I was looking at the patch tool the other day, reading the documentation. I don't know why. I'm not going to say why I was reading it. But layouts would be high on my list. Table occurrence right up there. Privilege sets. It's almost complete for like live development. I do appreciate, of course, there's multiple, and as far as I can tell, there's multiple initiatives at Claris, like quite a few, and the whole patch tool, which I take to be like it's you dehost the file and you patch and this and that. But what you're doing, Dan, it seems more in the kind of live coding, whether you're live coding onto a production file. I'm not recommending it, but I've seen it done. Or if you're live coding, if you're going through the interface into staging and then moving it over. But that's the way I live. But I vote for layouts next.
Yeah, layouts are good. I mean, if we're going to ask for everything in the world, what if you could copy and paste privilege sets? I've seen people say that they think it would be a security thing.
Well,
but I don't see how it'd be a security thing. If you're in here, you're in this dialogue, the security game is over. The fact that you can copy or paste from here is not adding another security vulnerability, unless we're imagining a scenario where someone who has full access is foolish enough to paste in XML objects that someone else gave them. But that's not really a threat model that I think that Claris needs to try to protect us against. Developers doing bad things because they're naive, and at least in this case. No,
I wouldn't turn it down. I wouldn't turn it down.
I would be happy. Yeah. I mean, hey, I was trying to think of places that you can't copy and paste. I mean, that shows how thorough they've been. Is that I was like, oh, I guess external data sources? I don't know. It's most places. Relationship graph, like Tony, like you said, it would be really interesting if you could actually copy the entire layout instead of having to create.
It would pair well with the layout objects.
So nice. Yeah, especially with the idea that it would paste in with all the parts in the right setup. I mean, that's one thing that's a little bit of work nowadays, which is matching up all the parts sizes and which parts exist. Being able
and
to
you
copy
could,
the whole,
yeah,
paste the whole layout would be great. That'd be so nice.
that would be the one I'd vote for next, if I had a vote. There's also some good questions. I see Rick is providing some answers to some of the questions, Rick Kalman. Eric, I don't know, I saw you putting some stuff in there. I don't know if you want to jump in with some questions or comments. Or one of
I can't
our
remember if it
hosts.
was.
Let's see. We said goodbye to Alexei.
Yeah.
Oh, you said, are you giving us the demo file? I think the answer was yes.
Yeah.
It's on the
Yeah,
GitHub
he answered
page.
right away.
Yep, it's in there. Oh, and hey, somebody asked. Now, I'm going to save this copy of the demo file because I did make a couple little tweaks. We're gonna have a please break glass file. Let's go mangle some XML and paste it. Just like while we're here, I should have done that before this demo and I didn't. So.
Oh, you're going to try and
Okay.
break it with layout objects? Oh,
I'm going to see what I can do. Just this is what happens. FileMaker objects XML.
I don't want to put Clay Mackel on the spot, although it is a question that's been lingering, like, off the record or on the record. How robust is the what do you call it, sanitation? When you like post code into an application, you're supposed to do code sanitize to make sure your SQL doesn't say Johnny drop tables or whatever. I wonder how much sanitation is done vis-a-vis valid XML. Layout objects would be tough because those pings and JPEGs can be insane. What are we doing here, Dan?
Just changing styles to Harry styles, but where'd it go? Where's the other? Well, whatever. I broke it. It says Harry styles instead of styles. Okay. Let's see what happens.
You don't name a field style. Oh, I was thinking of suffixes.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you see this?
What did it say?
FM Clip Tool said that doesn't look good.
What did it say?
Could not identify the data.
Oh, that's cool.
All right. Well, something about it didn't work. Let's go try some other modification then. Okay. Let's just try changing here. We got color wheel. And I'm going to make it a matching. Properly. What's that?
You could spell color properly.
It's with a U, right?
All right. We'll give you that one just for fun. Here you go. That's amazing. All right, we come back over here. Let's see. Is this going to crash our file? Let's try it. It didn't care about that.
Well, it depends. What was that tag supposed to do?
And it was the color style. It was the color for
something.
What was this? Oh, the color for this is that blue color of the text, I think. This is a demo file. So I can't. It actually did the right color though, so now I'm confused.
Copy it back out. Did it correct it?
Maybe I did something wrong. Let me try it again. Copy this. Copy. The XML to FileMaker objects. Over here. Paste. Let's see what it did. Let's copy that back to XML. Let's make a new window here so I can compare. Come on, BB Edit, do your find. I've got a keyboard shortcut for this on my my Mac. It's Control Shift equals. Non-matching lines, the location at the top. Okay, we don't care about that. Color wheel. It fixed it. Color wheel.
Did it really? Oh, you're saying that FileMaker fixed your tags because it saw your tags?
Pasting it, put it back. That is interesting.
Probably because David used to work there, I think.
What's that?
I think it's because David Head used to work there.
They don't just sanitize. They clean it up.
I had to look out for him. He was always changing the spelling of this.
So gives you confidence, right?
I don't know. That's kind of almost more scary. It fixes the XML? How does it know?
Yeah, well, how does it know?
It's examining the structure, I guess.
It's like, oh, the next thing has to be color. It can't be color wheel. That's spelled in a strange way.
Why would anything be that smart and be looking for that kind of thing?
Because
I don't know. I tried data. I changed it to data nobody. Let's try that.
Yeah, there's a few people I wish were here right now.
That should break. Yeah, there we go.
okay,
Paste it
so
in a
don't.
big empty
But
rectangle.
now David
Oh.
Simpson was saying that was
Oh,
bad.
look at that.
No,
The object disappeared.
it could be there and just lost forever, orphaned.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, this is why we did this in a copy of the file, because it's gone.
But now David Simpson was saying if you had badly formed XML, it would
Oh,
crash or
it
break.
just didn't keep the text, but look at that. Badly formed XML. Let me try that then. What else can we break?
Just
Anybody got any recommendations for how badly we
You
should
could
break
just
it?
remove a closing tag, maybe.
Yeah, let's try that. Paragraph style. We'll just get rid of that. How badly do we need to break this for it to cause problems?
Does David
Ah, see, that's the thing. I think if it's not valid XML, FM Clip Tools will yell at you.
now how does FM Clip Tools know?
Because it's actually using what calls it, system events. Where is it? To work with XML. Check clipboard for valid XML. Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I did this, so it's actually in the big. See, most of these scripts are a little tiny bit of things. They're loading. There's like the big library that does all the work. That's this file. This file is a lot of code in it. So this thing checks the clipboard for XML that represents FileMaker objects, returns true if it does, false if not. Okay. It has to do a special check for clipboard has theme because the themes were a little bit weird the way they're in the clipboard. Is string valid? So it tests the clipboard for that. And that checks for XML that returns, updates the current. Makes new XML data with, okay, so system events is saying, okay, take the text in the clipboard, turn it into an XML data. So if it's malformed, that will fail. That's what I thought.
Because it's in a nice.
It looks like somebody was actually thinking about a lot of different things when they programmed this.
It took a long time to build this. So yeah, and special handling for oh, look at that. It does work for groups and custom functions. I forgot. I updated that back in when there was some developer, some preparation.
Look at that active development 2025.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, other than that, I've been sitting around for a long time. And just no actual change. Just note that this automatically supports theme. Yeah.
When you say it supports themes, in what context are you digging in, finding the custom themes and
you can copy a theme. Oh, maybe not that one. There you go. You can copy custom themes and paste them in another file. Or, as pointed out before, the import button will often work really well for that. But I added support for themes. Somebody asked, and it wasn't too tricky, although they are a little different.
Is that custom themes? Does that come back as clipboard or just plain text?
I'm checking right now. If I copy, and I'm going to show you another little bit of AppleScript stuff. Clipboard info. What's in the clipboard? Class XMTH. So it is. That is right. It is a non-text. I mean, it is text, but it's not stored as.
You got to crack it. You got to crack the code.
Yeah. So, and I think if I now say
custom menus are text, just FYI for anyone who cares.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. Did you see that?
What happened?
I said convert FM objects to XML. The clipboard did not contain any FileMaker objects. I thought it supported themes. All right, well, maybe I'm wrong. I thought it supported themes, but yeah,
maybe it needs the.
Tony, yours point's a good one. Custom menus. It might be the machine I'm on, or it might be that it doesn't.
17 and up custom menus. I played with it. 17 and up, it's plain text and.
Yeah, of course you can't copy the standard one.
No, you got to make. but it works, and that's a cool feature.
Yep.
And yeah, there's not much missing. 3 things
Yeah.
that I know of.
You copy that. If I go to BB Edit, paste, one object, paste.
Plain text, no cracking required.
No cracking. Yeah. I mean, hey, if they were willing to put the raw XML into the clipboard, it's probably a bad idea.
Well,
I mean,
it was a bit of a pivot that they did plain text for that, and I checked. They did everything, like the entire hierarchy of the custom menu structure.
Yep. There were a couple weird little bugs that have since been fixed for a while with custom menus pasting. There was a certain weird thing where if you canceled, it wouldn't actually cancel, but it would break it or something like that. But that's since been fixed. We have not yet managed to figure out a way to actually cause the file any damage. If anybody
actually, one other
knows,
suggestion to break it. It says if you create a tab
Yeah.
control with zero enclosed tabs, it might crash.
ooh, let's try that.
Okay.
Hey,
It might crash.
okay.
And he says he's not responsible for anything that happens to your
Wait, was that
for my computer? This is a virtual machine, man. This is
And
why
by the
you
way,
do
just
stuff
for
in a virtual machine.
Yeah, divide by 0.
This whole window is please break glass. I don't think we'd have a hard time doing anything inside this VM that can hurt my Mac. Let's
And for
copy
anyone
this.
listening to the recording, I would remind them the goal is not to break the code.
Yes.
What your limitations are.
Okay, so where are we saying make tab control object, tab width? There, I can soft wrap so I can see all this.
Close tabs.
Tab control object, tab height, visibility key, visibility index. Where's the number of tabs?
Search for tabs, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
What do we got here?
Extended attributes, styles. Got all the styles.
Yeesh.
Well, you can, Dan, I usually delete those, like the full CSS and the override via whatever's called the.
Well, if you make a peculiar number of tabs, then maybe you'll be able to find that number.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. Here's the tab panel object.
Make a, I don't know, 13 tabs or something like that. See if you can find 13 somewhere.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to do something because I'm looking here and I'm seeing it says tab panel object, and it's ends right away.
Can you collapse the CSS?
Yes, let's do that.
And we'll see the guts.
My scrolling's being a little bit unhappy. There we go.
All right. So what do we got? 44 lines. How hard could it be to find?
Well, here I like the idea of maybe put multiple tabs on it.
I'd get a double digit if you can.
Oh, double digits? Okay.
Yeah, because then
because
you can search for 3, but 3 could be everywhere. But if you search for 12 or 13, it's
you can't start with numbers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well,
you can, but you have to put quotes around it. It won't do it for you.
I think you could search for any one of these, right?
You think so?
Well, I mean, but
that's not going to give you the number. He's trying to get that. We're trying to get the count, right? But
you'll find it. We'll find it.
I don't know. Are people enjoying this? I mean, some of us are having fun trying to break things. If people are getting bored, they can tell us.
Well, I guess at 7 o'clock we should be showing off another application here real quick. I mean, we can always come back to this after that if you want.
Anybody who wants to break things.
It'd be a good time. Anyone who's on the Zoom call, don't, no question is too silly, right? Maybe think of anything that you want to actually fix rather than break.
Oh yeah. Oops.
Yeah, we could. I can put this on pause and we can do the other presentation then, right?
Last call.
Because it's a biggest peek at XML.
Oh, and I'll say one thing. Just with the tools that Dan has provided, if you don't do anything else, just cracking the XML and looking at the XML can be pretty educational in terms of showing, how FileMaker builds what it builds.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting to go and dig into this stuff and see what it's doing. I deleted one of the objects completely. It still did something. All right. Well,
that was really terrific presentation. It'll be recorded, and
right.
I like this approach, Dan, what you're doing. Very direct. I thought when you had layout fields and you turned them into script steps, that's bread and butter. You know what I mean?
I found that really useful, just being able to convert between different object types. I think it even had something where you could copy multi-objects, would let you copy like a bunch of variables. Forget what it does with those. You say FM objects to multi-objects. There it is. I've got a keyboard shortcut on my machine. But that actually copies that copies the name of the variable and the calculation of what they're being set to in the clipboard. So
Very
with
cool.
tab delimited. So yeah, it does a couple little things where it tries to, and I could add more to it later. I just haven't.
What were the pull requests you got so far?
Pull requests. Let's go see. Let's see what I need to get slapped on my wrist for. Let's see. Oh, Matt, 2 years ago. I'm very sorry, Matt. He had a suggestion about a dedicated snippets folder and scripts for snippet management, and he actually has some useful things about doing that. And he was explaining to me some things about how GitHub works, where I could have that, where I have like one example, and then have my own contents of the folder would be my own. So I have to figure out the time to do that. I just didn't want to do it right before I was going to show this to everybody and maybe cause problems with the repo. So he's got a whole idea in here where it would be alongside the scripts, there would be like a snippets folder. And in here would be like a README, and then you could put in your own useful blocks of, maybe I'd have one demo snippet, but then you would have a way for you to go and like, there would be a like save snippet or load snippet. And you'd be able to pick from the list of stuff in here. And maybe there'd be subfolders. So you'd be able to pick which, it's custom functions and group them that way. So I think it's a great idea. I just need to actually get around to doing it. And any issues? Go ahead.
No, I'm saying, and he did the video. Did you the video that I saw where Matt Petrosky had two developers and they were using, I think, Typinator with your transformation or what do you call it, conversion things under the hood. So people are using it. So very cool. Yeah.
It's like I said, you saw me. I'm a little clunky picking things from the menu because I've got keyboard shortcuts for the ones I use the most often. Where I get a keyboard shortcut and they run. Now, here's the note about this, that FileMaker 21, which is what I'm running here, aka FileMaker 2024, they tweaked something. So like I had added an FM clip tools for themes to work with 19 and 20, which was unlike all the other snippet types, the clipboard object types. But then they fixed it. So now themes is the same as all the rest. So I need to have it switch back. And then I'll need to know which version of FileMaker you want to target when you're converting from XML back to objects. Because it might not be that you just copied it from 21. It might be you saved it as a snippet somewhere. So I have to figure out, this might be this thing about having like a user preference file. You can say what version you're working with or something. So that's another part of the pull request, was to have that kind of.
So what they changed? File. They changed the 4-letter code or something.
They changed. Where was it? Oh, it didn't have a proper class and data in the clipboard that AppleScript can see. It was like some kind of it wasn't straight XML. It was some kind of weird object in the clipboard. Like when you looked at clipboard info, it didn't say this nice little class XMTH. It did something weird. And I had to use some AppleScript Objective-C bridge code.
Very cool.
I just lost my headphones.
Oh, there goes Rick. Oh, he jumped. But anyway, nice to see Rick on the call. In the chat logs. Okay.
Right. Probably so screen, right? So people so we can do the other demo.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks for presenting.
All right.
That
Yeah.
was awesome.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah,
You
you're
don't have
welcome.
to
That was
leave,
fun.
of course, but we just have another demo for probably about
Oh, I
15,
want to see
20
it.
minutes. And then yeah, we can audience preference after that.
So, can you guys hear me?
You're a little low.
Well, I'll speak up. How's that?
Still kind of low.
So I'm going to begin by just showing you the app on my phone for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to run my keynote presentation and come back to the app afterward. This is the full access to go app that people will use for the October conference. You're looking at the home screen. There's a map function, which I'll be showing you about in my keynote. And there is a menu with a number of things. So for instance, if you wanted to look at the general schedule to see what's happening day by day, kind of like when the school bell rings, or what are the sessions that are going on, the little red heart indicates that it's a favorite. The little blue heart indicates that it is something that, in my case, I'm presenting that session. If you tap on any one of them, you can see the details of that session. And then we also have lists of the presenters and lists of the attendees, and a guide to where the meeting rooms are located, and a guide to where the guest rooms are located. And if you need to see room numbers, we've got that in there too. And I know I'm going real fast in the constraint of time this evening. And the last thing we added just the other day was a feedback function, so that you could choose to, rate the conference and choose the thing that you like best, or the thing that you liked least, or write some kind of a comment. And with that, I'm just going to go and change the share to share my keynote with you. This was to give developers a general idea of what the app was built for, how we got it built, and here we go. So I'm Dennis Burnham. I'm in Denver. The picture you see of me was photographed when I started working in FileMaker back in 1960. And what you see on the left is what I just showed you on the phone, what the app looks like there. And what you see on the right is what the app looks like on an iPad or in FileMaker Pro on a laptop. And if I'll just take a moment to second what Tony was saying before about layouts, one of the things that I would love to see is improvements with layouts. The reason why you see this landscape orientation is because the same layout that works for the iPad also works for FileMaker Pro. So what is it? The FileMaker app is for conference attendees. It's similar to what people had with DevCon to go and perhaps with Engage to go. I didn't see Engage to go, but there's some big differences. And the main reason is that we're not in a hotel or conference facility. We're at a place called the Jesuit Retreat Center. And the way this all began was when John Howell put out a request a few months ago, can somebody make a map? And I raised my hand and I thought, well, it wouldn't be too hard to make a map. And originally I thought it would be something we would hand out to people on paper. But once you start working with it, I realized it could be interactive in FileMaker. So the attendees walking around would be able to use their phone to figure out where they are, where to go next. And I got familiar with where the buildings are located. And originally I thought I would use Google Maps and their API, but the problem with that is that it makes it hard for it to scale on different size devices. And also the image taken from satellites shows the foliage, which covers up a lot of the rooftops at this location in Los Altos, California. So one by one, lots of ideas started to come along, and as a committee, we were developing it with a number of people working together. I started in Photoshop by taking the satellite image from Google Maps and dimming it so that I could focus on the buildings in Illustrator, and made a little legend that numbered the buildings and identified which one was which. and worked with layers in Illustrator, and then eventually put it into FileMaker in a container field similar to what you're looking at on the right. We soon discovered that those little black buttons weren't big enough, and so in layout mode, you're looking at the layout for the iPad and FileMaker Pro on the left, and the layout for the iPhone on the right. The little colored buttons in the bottom section allow you to filter whether you want to look at all the buildings or just the ones where the meeting sessions occur or just the ones where guest rooms occur. And I want to point out that naming these objects was really, really helpful, because very often what I had to do was use the feature where you could hide everything else and just work on the one I was working on for either giving it a color or maybe assigning a script to it. So I'm a big proponent of taking the time to name objects. So in practice, this is what the maps look like when you're looking at them on the device. You can see that the blue ones indicate the sessions, and the yellowish ones indicate where the guest rooms are, and the green button, of course, will show all. There are a few buildings that we're not allowed to go to because the priests use them for their residences, and there's a chapel that we're not holding any sessions in. But you could go there, I suppose, and pray for the next version of FileMaker. And there were a number of other considerations that I'll just run through very quickly because I know we are limited with time. We have to concern ourselves with the internet connectivity on the site. What if the internet went down? Will we still be able to use Wi-Fi? Since it's Silicon Valley, the cellular service is probably real good. And one of our team members is bringing a lot of equipment so that we'll be independent of the Jesuit Retreat Center for our own internet connectivity. But working with a number of people where several people all had full access developer control over the database reminded me of the, that phrase that says a camel is a horse designed by a committee. You got to be real careful with a project like that, even though we had a lot of time. We started in June, almost 4 months ahead of the October deadline. So it's now more than halfway there. We're inside of 90 days, and we've got an app that's almost ready to distribute. At the Jesuit Retreat Center, there are 4 buildings that are used for events and 5 buildings where people will be doing their overnight accommodations. 1 building out of those is used for both events and guest rooms. 3 of them are off limits to us. 1 is the office building where people arrive. There's the chapel, there's the dining room where we're going to have our meals. And then there's 1 other building that's just really small, so we're going to use that for leadership staff meetings. I came up with the idea of including walking directions, because once people are on site, they can use the mapping in order to guide themselves from place to place, the same way that you would if you're walking around town from a parking lot to a movie theater or something. I call it the Santa Claus coordinates that we have at the moment, because not being on site, I was only able to get the coordinates by using Google Maps in order to figure out where they are. But the day before the conference begins, my plan is to walk around the property and take more precise location coordinates so that people will be able to be guided directly to the entry door. Santa Claus doesn't have to worry about the doorway because he just lands on the rooftop. If you were to tap on that button for walking directions now, of course, it would tell you how to get there on foot from wherever you live, which doesn't make much sense. But once you're on site, it'll guide you from wherever you're standing to whatever the destination is for your next event or meal. I used the same layout, shape, and size for all of the pop-up menus and information screens. It's true that I could have made them a little bit larger for the FileMaker Pro or the iPad users, but it was my decision in the beginning to just conserve it to 1 layout for all platforms. And that was just to make sure that there wouldn't be errors that occur where somebody has gone in to make a change on a layout and neglected to make the same change on all the other layouts that present the same information. We came up with a menu of features that you can drill into, and this has changed as we've gone along. So it started with the sessions and the schedule and the presenters. A few weeks ago, we added the favorites. And the different screens that you see on the right just are indicative of what you would see if you tapped on any one of those menu items. The little window shows up either as a card window or a dialog window, and then closes when you're done looking at it. In the case of the lodging, as I showed you before, you've got the room numbers also. And we've included some directions so that if people have the app in their pocket when they land at San Jose or San Francisco or Oakland, they can just tap the button to get to the Jesuit Retreat Center, or on their way out, the red button will get them to whatever airport they're going to. Just a few days ago, we added the feedback option. That's new, and there probably will be other things added in the next week or so. Website connectivity was a question. In the beginning, I didn't have access to the database that Ron was telling you about this evening that's running on the same server, but it's the website is using that database and WordPress in order to present information to people who use the website to learn about it. So I just scraped information from there in order to populate certain tables. Now those tables are being populated with a refresh script that's running in FileMaker server on a recurring schedule. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. In file options, we specified that everybody would log in with guest access. The privilege set is data entry only. We made an icon that would show up nicely instead of the usual Claris icon that I think people sometimes find that confusing if they have several apps running. And we hid the toolbars and decided what layout would be the landing one. We had to rebuild that drop-down menu because WebDirect doesn't actually work the same way as FileMaker Pro when you tap on things that are in that button bar. And we added some welcome features for people to register or send an email to somebody else who might want to attend. And then the on first window open script is important because it's storing what device and platform privilege set and the width of whatever device they're on. My particular iPhone, as I showed you a moment ago, is the iPhone 13 mini, which is one of the smallest ones. But every layout is going to center in whatever is the width of anybody else's phone. We've also made it accessible in WebDirect. So people in WebDirect, whether they're on an Android device or whether they're using a browser on a Windows laptop or a Mac laptop, will be able to access it in WebDirect. We added this favorites feature on July 30th, and the requirement is that somebody, at least until yesterday, this was a requirement. They had to go to the website to log in and become an attendee of the conference, and then they could select their favorites. And then those favorites would show up on the mobile app. August 18th is Monday, and that's the day that we expect to distribute it to people now that it has the new MirrorSync deployment that I'll talk to you about in a couple of minutes. So as soon as you have expressed any favorites in the website, that database synchronizes with the mobile app database that's running on the same server. And then you see your favorites organized by date and time. The little red heart indicates that you've made that one a favorite, and the blue heart indicates that that's a session that you are presenting. The reason for that is just to make sure that you show up at the right time and place when you're a presenter, that you're not lost somewhere on the property. And there's something else that you don't see here, which is that if you have two sessions specified as favorites during the same time slot, there's a little warning indicator that will come up so that you can at least be aware that you've chosen more than one. I used to do that with DevCon to Go until I made my final decision of which one I wanted to attend at a certain time. This is a screen that's going to be included in our Getting Started guide that's going to be distributed with the app on Monday. So you don't have to read the fine print here, but the reason I made this was because some people want to know how to make a shortcut that will show up on the desktop of their laptop or on the home screen of their tablet. So for Windows or Mac, these are the instructions for how to do that. I've also recorded a 10-minute video that explains how you can use the profile that we've made so that the home screen icon that looks like an app will be somewhere on the screen of your iPad or your iPhone. And when you tap that, it just launches the FileMaker Go app. There's a reason for that that I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. So looking under the hood, we start with the relationship graph and the list of tables. And this has changed a little bit since July 31st, but substantially it's this. It begins with this, the only table actually resides on the mobile device that somebody's carrying. It only has one record in that table. And in that record, there's a field called My Contact ID, and that's what establishes the connection to the favorites. In WebDirect, it's a similar field, except it's a global field called WD Contact ID. And when somebody first decides to use the favorites feature, they put their ID into that field by entering their email address. We have everybody's email address in the table of attendees. So if they put in their email address, we look up their contact ID and stick it in that field, and then it makes it easy for the information to show up whenever they want to look at their favorites. As of yesterday, we're now using MirrorSync. So whenever there is a version update, the MirrorSync triggers a notice to the user telling them that the file can be updated now, or they could just wait until they want to do it a little bit later on. There are a few tables that are Cartesian joins to the home table. One is the menu, that little button bar that you saw with the different menu options, and the various locations. And the reason you see two table occurrences for locations is one of them is filtered by just the buildings that somebody would go to if they use the value list that exists for the buildings. So the favorites are connected, as I said, by the contact ID, and any platform somebody's on will enable that to work. Then there's one table occurrence we made that's called home favorites, and that's just one that will look up the icons that are either red for your favorite or blue if you're a presenter. Of course, the favorites are connected to the sessions, and they're joined by the session ID. And then we have a table of attendees that we import from the database that's hosting the website, or supporting the website, I should say. And those blue table occurrences you see are located in that other database. We gave it the nickname EMS for Event Management System. And there's a server script that I'll show you in a little bit that manages to bring that data in. You can't import data from one database to another on FileMaker server. So when we realized that that wasn't working, and it was what we were doing was just taking too long, we changed to a totally different system. And that begins by just mentioning to you that both databases are located on the same server. So the external data source doesn't use FMNet, it uses the file : reference. So what FileMaker Server is doing now on a schedule of every 10 minutes is it's going to 4 tables in the EMS database that are called contacts, presentations, events, and assigned. Those names were given to us. We started out with them, probably would have named them differently if we could, and Ron has told us the reasons why. But what we're doing from those tables is we're exporting merge files, in data files in the merge format, and we're storing them in the FMS documents folder. And then our other database is importing those merge files into the attendees, which corresponds to the contacts, schedule, which corresponds to events, sessions, which corresponds to presentations, and favorites, which corresponds to assigned. All of that takes just a matter of 9 or 10 seconds for all of that to work. And then at the end of it, the server goes ahead and it removes those 4 files from the documents directory on FileMaker Server. So yesterday, or the day before yesterday, Dennis Burnham volunteered to help us with 360works MirrorSync. And it's terrific that he did that. It's working already. We changed the button bar at the bottom of the 2 screens so that it now says MirrorSync. And when somebody taps on that button, it will just refresh whatever favorites may have changed. All the rest of the data we expect to be consistent. But if the version happened to change and the version number changed, what it would do is update the entire database with whatever is the newest version. And that takes just a few seconds longer than the normal data refresh. So again, August 18th on Monday, you'll be able to download the zip file from the website. And this is another piece of helpful information, shall we say, that's in the Getting Started document. A lot of times people don't know how to use FileMaker Go and to manage the, where is it on the computer, or how do you get the files onto it? What if you need to remove it? And many of you probably know that if you have older versions of FileMaker Go in your computer, each one of them has its own folder. So be very careful if you ever delete a FileMaker Go folder from this list of files. You're also going to lose whatever database apps are in that folder. So here I'm just giving people instructions for how to manage that on a Macintosh when your phone is connected with a wire. And the same thing in Windows, except the look and feel of it is a little bit different. But basically, you're choosing this this window that shows you the contents of what's on your phone: the movies, the music, documents, and the files, including FileMaker Go, are among those. Now, Dennis Burnham recommended, and I agree with him, that the best way to get this app onto your iPad or your iPhone is to download it to your computer and then email it to yourself. And so it's a step-by-step process, and I think you probably will agree with me. This is what makes FileMaker Go so complicated for people. When you are first connected with a wire, if you were to look at that screen on your computer, you'd see that it doesn't exist yet in the FileMaker Go folder. But after you email it to yourself, it will be in your email inbox. So this screenshot was made the day before yesterday, and at the time I took the screenshot, of course, it was the most recent email that I had received. It's right up there at the top. When you tap on that email, of course, I didn't put any message to myself. I didn't need to say anything to myself. So you only see the attachment when you tap on that email. And then if you go over to the right of it, you see there's the download button. So when you download that, what happens is the first thing iOS tells you is, where do you want to put it? And you get a choice of either your documents, your downloads, or you can save it as an attachment. I choose to put it in the downloads. Then you have to find the app that is called Files. Every iOS device has this app in it. And in that app called Files is where you have your documents and your downloads and maybe other things as well. So when you tap on that, it shows you, in this case, all the things that are recent. Well, because it was done chronologically at the time I made that screenshot, the app that was downloaded from the website is the very first thing at the top, which we abbreviated the name to be FA2Go. And I see that in the recents, and you can see in the lower left corner, recents is colored blue because it's the list that I'm looking at. Now, way down in the bottom corner, when you tap on the attachment, it doesn't actually open your FileMaker app, but it does give you this little icon at the bottom, which we all know that icon represents sharing. Well, I really don't want to share it, but that's the thing you have to tap in order to decide what app do you want to use to open that. Now, this assumes, of course, that you have FileMaker Go already on your phone or your iPad. And if you do, then FileMaker Go will be visible where this arrow is pointing to it. And then when you tap on it, it all of a sudden shows up in your directory of your files that are on your phone, and it opens up. When you tap on it right away, on My Favorites, it asks for your email address. So you type in your email address, it looks up your contact ID. MirrorSync tells you that it's updating your favorites from whatever is in the website, and then there you see them. So if you look at the very first one, the reason why it's got a blue heart and a red heart is because I'm presenting that session, and it's just an extra way of reminding me that I better be there on time and tell me where I'm supposed to be. So when you download the zip file, there are three things that will be in that zip file. The first one is this FA2Go file, which is only 815 kilobytes. MirrorSync or 360works, they call that the launcher. It's what will launch the actual app. The full access to Go getting started guide is, I think it's about an 11-page PDF file with step-by-step information for people. And the third thing that is in the zip file is that profile that I talked about. Now, I make these profiles for my customers all the time because they don't know how to navigate within FileMaker Go to get to the host name or the file name. All they want to do is tap on something that looks like an app. And someone in the community a few years ago made something that was called an iOS app maker. And what it does is it produces a profile which you email to yourself, and then when you tap on it, it ends up going into the area called VPN and device management. You have to put in your password, and then it automatically installs. The beauty of it is that when it shows up on the home screen of your phone or your iPad, it has the icon that we've made for it, which all you have to do is tap on that, and it opens up FileMaker Go automatically. There is a video that I made that runs about 10 minutes long, and in this full access to Go getting started guide, there is a link to that so that you can watch that video and actually go through it step by step at your own pace. And that takes us to the website, which is the end of my formal presentation, and I can take questions or I can go into a live demo if you'd like. Did I make it in the 15-minute limit, Eric?
No, that's all right.
Well, I tried.
That's fine.
Give me an A for effort.
So, this is pretty much the audience portion at this point, where if there's any Q&A for either presenters, either for this app or for the or for FM Clip Tools and all that XML that we were doing, go ahead and ask before they go away, because you can't ask the video. No questions?
I was going to ask Dennis, when you talked about the newest version, so that's the mirror sync, that was to sync to get like new data into the file? Or was it also structured? Was it like you could get like a new copy of the file?
Yes, you're getting an actual copy of all the data that's being refreshed. I should say that working with the other organizers of the event, we don't expect the schedule to change. You know, the day-by-day, hourly time slots are probably never going to change between now and the conference. There may be some sessions that get added that aren't on the list already. There may be, we hope there will be, a few more attendees who come on board, so that list of attendees will be refreshed. And the main thing to know about those things is you as the user aren't doing any data entry on any of that. You're just reading what's in the list. But the favorites are something where you're having some direct interaction with the website. And the reason that MirrorSync is so useful for us is because until we had MirrorSync, you had to go to the website and express your preferences there for the favorites that you wanted to attend. And 10 minutes later, they would show up when the server has done its 10-minute scheduled refresh. Working with MirrorSync allows it to be instantaneous, so that when you decide by looking at the list of sessions that you want to make something a favorite that isn't yet one of your favorites, it will just do that right away. Conversely, if you decide there's one that's not going to be a favorite, you can tap on that and it will do it right away. And you won't have to wait 10 minutes for it to cycle around.
Right. Nice.
There are a few other things that are interactive. You know, the feedback is one where obviously you're doing a little bit of read-write where you're giving us your opinion of what you liked or didn't like about the event. I can't think of anything else right now that has any read-write.
The the fact that we have David Simpson here and Dan's presentation, I just imagine he is like, because he knows so much under the hood stuff, I think, about FileMaker files. I'm just wondering what else we had have to say about that.
Oh, well, I think you created something pretty nice there. I'm working on a tool for full access that'll be cross-platform, but I think you did a real good job, of adding a bunch of neat feature to what you've built here.
Oh, thanks. And again, and the interesting thing is a lot of that, if you have the base elements plugin, a lot of that could be built into a FileMaker file. It's just that whenever I thought about doing that, I thought it would be really annoying if I'm like in managed database and I want to run a script that's in a FileMaker file because managed database is modal. So I couldn't run a script it would have to be like a different copy of FileMaker running just that one file. So, but a lot of those tools could be made into like, I don't know. Yeah, into a like little FileMaker app.
Right.
I think there's room for both. Dan's comment about the Apple script gives you the ability to work with FileMaker code even when FileMaker itself is modal. I'm just repeating what you said. So that's and then Dan, actually you demoed you're using both because you've got the other use case where you're trying to move code from point A to point B. From a Mac to a Windows and this and that, and that's where little FileMaker utility file with the base elements or the Monkey Bread plugin
That could
comes
come in
in
handy. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other
David,
thing is that I
sorry.
don't know if the base elements function to set things into the clipboard can add objects. In other words, I think the base elements set clipboard says set the clipboard to this type, and now the clipboard has only that type. With AppleScript, I'm able to like add on several. That multi-objects thing wouldn't work, I think, if it was base elements only.
Wait. I might have some insight because I built a file. I did a demo for the LA group FM disk, and it's maybe Dan, I'm not understanding your question or your thought. It's you just copy the object and the base elements figures out what type of object it is, whether it's a script type or what
I'm
am I
saying
missing?
when you're setting into the clipboard, that multi-objects thing lets you say set the clipboard to these field definitions and these layout objects and these script steps, and there's different types in the clipboard. Whereas I think with the base elements, you were setting the clipboard to a single type.
Yeah, it's one type of object at a time. I've never sent the XML to like a collection of different objects.
It's really interesting. Well, you're putting in those different, like you saw in the Apple script, it was like a list of things, classes, and you could actually go and say clipboard info, and you'll see it's class XMFD, XMSS. You'll see a whole list of them. This, interestingly enough, when you copy FileMaker layout objects, the different types in the clipboard are the FileMaker layout objects.
Yep.
A TIFF.
Yep.
It's a picture of all those layout objects together. A PNG, a JPEG, several other graphics types. I think a bitmap. So I mean, they made it so that when you copy FileMaker layout objects, you could paste them into like a graphics program and because it'll paste in whatever format that graphics program prefers from the clipboard. And I don't think that.
I want to answer you had another question in the chat. But I'll wait until you're ready for it if you want to talk with Tony first.
No, I think that's all I had to say on that.
Well, let me actually just one thought I want to get out in line with what Dan's saying. With this clipboard stuff, one of the use cases that comes up a lot, as we all know, if you're moving like a feature, it often involves, putting the custom function in first, putting the script in next. I'm just giving one example, and then putting the button in third. And I'll have to think, Dan, and maybe we'll talk offline about what you're saying. But the file that I did for the LA group, and I'll send it to you, Dan. Anyone else who asks, just hit me on a DM. It basically has one record per, one record for the custom function, one record for the script, one record for the button. But anyway, Dennis, what Thanks for your
Dan-
patience. And
Dan had a question about whether the newest version is limited to just the data or also the structure. And the answer is it does both. MirrorSync is
nice.
sensitive to a version number that's in the hosted database. When that version number changes, the user will be given the option to either update right away or wait until later. The data refresh by itself takes just a few seconds. If they were to update the entire version, then it takes maybe a minute and a half. It's just a little bit longer. And I did try it already, and I found that it worked. We added a couple of layouts yesterday, and the version update just brought them right in.
So that's literally updating like the actual FMP structure files being replaced.
That's
and
right.
I'm assuming, so MirrorSync, I think I'd seen that they have a way of doing that. So it must be that the server runs a backup, moves the backup to the documents folder, puts that into a container, and then that little helper file is able to pull that down from the FileMaker server into a local container, close the file that they were looking at, and then export out the new version and then open that up. Something like that. So I've done something
I would
similar.
say that something like that is the key word there, because I admit that I don't know how the magic works, but I saw it demonstrated for the first time on what's today, Thursday. So that was on Tuesday. And then yesterday I had the occasion to create a new version number and saw that it gave me that option to do that update.
That's great. That's really useful. We did
So Ron
one
had
place
some more of the details on that, huh?
Yeah, for instance, if I had to make a change in a script, and refreshing the data wouldn't refresh the new script, but refreshing the structure does.
Yep.
they just,
we had the place
sorry.
I worked before. We kind of did a rolled our own for that because I guess we had enough that we didn't want to have to buy the whole 360 Works package. But it seems like that's a really good deal to not have to build it yourself. It's a lot of effort. That's great.
He's made that a real big part of his business for many years already, and there's something new about the new version that he's doing, and that's why I think he wanted to volunteer to help us at the conference by, doing the work for us.
Yeah, that's great.
He did a presentation for the Los Angeles group. I think it was a month or two ago. Easy to find.
He did the Kentucky one a few weeks ago also.
Yeah. And he may be doing some kind of tricky stuff with Java, because a lot of what they do.
Java, JavaScript.
No, actually Java, like the programming language.
360 Works
Tony,
does a lot of Java. They do a lot of Java. They were the ones who made Scriptmaster, which was this whole thing that would let you write Java code. Well, Groovy, which is a flavor of Java. And you could compile that as FileMaker functions using their Scriptmaster plugin. I think that's still out there. You can still do that. I used that for a bunch of interesting projects back in the day.
Yeah, and that's the core. That's the core of their many different plugins. Is they're all they've got like a core library, much Dan as you've got a core library for your AppleScript subroutines.
Tony, we had a 3-hour session with Jesse Barnum the other day, and it was recorded. I could send you the link to that if you want, and that way you'd be able to watch how he did the installation in our app.
But that's public?
Pardon?
That recording's public?
John, any reason why I shouldn't share it with them?
I'm sorry.
I'm if it keeps you safer. I actually have a lot of respect for Jesse Barnum. He when he came into the FileMaker community, he did a little bit of a tour around the country. He managed to hit New York and came to our user group. Dan, I don't know if you were there for that one. But anyway, we wound up going out to dinner, and he's been a busy fellow, him and his team.
What was the question?
His son works with him too, and his brother Sam is coming with him to the conference in October.
Nice.
What was the question you had for me, Dennis? There's too much going
I
on.
can't hear you, John.
Sorry, what was the question you had for me?
we were talking about the way that MirrorSync gets installed, and I didn't know if it's appropriate. Can I send Tony the link to the 3-hour session that we did the other day?
No, we probably need to discuss that first. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
But
That's kind of
it's
kind
on
of
my
a-
radar. It's okay, John.
No, I don't need. You don't need to apologize. I'm just saying it's kind of a proprietary thing that we're doing, so that's a whole different conversation.
It's all good.
Oh, well,
I got my eye
speaking
on it. First customer that asked for that. I'd like to take it for a spin. He had some good licensing from the LA. I attended the LA. I didn't go to Kentucky because I'd seen the presentation in LA, so it'd be redundant. But he a very appealing option. Like I think there was a single user sync. I told my coding partner about it, and I'm just, looking forward to the first opportunity to need it.
Speaking of proprietary, is the local copy of the app, is that going to be open or is it closed?
It's closed to the extent that everybody is logging in with guest access.
Oh, what I meant is the file itself. Like, can you actually? Because like on the Engage to Go one, you can open it up and look at all the layouts and scripts and even modify it if you want. Is this one open in that way or no?
We haven't done that yet. I wouldn't mind having a discussion about that after the conference, but we've got enough hands in it right now.
Well, no, yeah, it's just people were able to edit their own local copy, and then, of course, to break it if they wanted to. But
And also there's the show us. We've done a fair bit of
198.
DIGFM has done a fair bit of show us the code kind of presentations. We like code.
Well, my purpose tonight with the keynote that I showed you was to give you like a guided tour of what's in the code without actually, opening it up.
No, it was a good above the, what is it, under the hood and below the hood. That was a above the hood presentation. All good, and with some pretty fancy pants slideshow stuff there.
yeah, I know a lot of work into that.
Well, I
Yes,
appreciate you guys sticking around for it tonight.
That's good. And
So
you said
David
that
Simpson,
the
are you at the? Oh, sorry, Eric. Go ahead, please.
Oh, you're saying that the app is available next week?
Yeah, my goal is to have it
Monday.
ready for distribution on Monday.
And do you have to be an attendee to be able to get to get that, or you get anybody?
You don't have to be an attendee to download the app, but you have to be an attendee to make any favorites.
Okay.
That's fair. What's the minimum version?
The minimum version for
To just open it.
FileMaker 25.
Really?
2025. Yeah, no, come on, we're pushing it.
Stay
Only
on
use the latest version or you can't come.
Well, I mean,
in
if
file
you're using-
options, the
I guess it doesn't really
minimum
matter. You're
version
using
is
FileMaker
20.
Go anyway, right? So it's like
Wait, Dennis is leaking some inside information here. What's the?
It says
I'm just
20
saying
right
that-
now, but we're going to discuss that, Dennis.
Well, if you want to raise it, you can, but I just didn't want anybody to be unable to see some things that are new in 21, like layout calculations, for example. You wouldn't
whatever.
see it if you were in an old.
We could go as low as FileMaker 2024, which is version 21, I would think, but we should go up a little higher. Kind of push people to come.
Well, that's a lively conversation, and
Isn't it?
we're on a recorded phone call. So I'll say, I would actually recommend that everyone on
depends
this
if you want to be hired by Claris or not.
everyone on this call should upgrade to the latest version and let us know how it goes.
Why did you say that before Rick left?
I'm
We can watch the recording.
what I did say is the 20 FileMaker server 21 dot something dot 5, the one that ends in dot 5. I haven't heard any problems, no issues. See, that's a
How
very
long has it been
positive
out?
comment.
Thank you.
There's version 22 that came out yesterday.
There's yeah, 22. Actually, what's interesting, Claris themselves backpatched 20. Like, all right, everyone knows that we're on version 22, right? Some people even know what year that means. But for those who are numerically inclined,
Just subtract 2002.
just like my life's very complex. So we're what FileMaker shipped. I thought it was interesting that they shipped something for 22 and 21. That's always interesting when FileMaker backpatches. It wasn't even a backpatch. It was like, as far as I can tell, it was an Ubuntu script.
Rick
But
Kalman
anyway.
was on Richard Carlton's video today talking about that patch being in 2 versions at the same time.
Yeah, and I look, I have a Fortune. Well, let's put it this way. I have exactly one Fortune 1000 customer. There's not that many of them, but I have one. And,
This is only 1,000, right?
That's because that's why they call it Fortune 1000. But the point of the story is that in the world that most of us live in, you can't always get, some giant company to just like immediately upgrade to the latest version. It's just, anyway, whatever. That's just reality. But I'm impressed with, I've been telling customers, I told a customer today, I actually told a customer, I previously told him to go to FileMaker Server 20. I told him most recently, go to 21.5, the one that ends in .5. And also I have a workround.
Wait. So the latest one has Tony's approval, seal of approval.
You don't follow your own advice, upgrade to the latest. Let me know how it goes. I do have a bug patch. There is, and this is all public information, and I'll quote other developers if I have to. There's a bug patch where conditional formatting, you all saw that?
Yeah, that's
if you have conditional formatting in placeholder. So I saw that, and I very quietly posted on FM Soup with that lovely interface that you have over there about how to do conditional formatting without using conditional formatting. Real world use case came up. Customer had a field on 20 layouts, and they needed to change the logic behind their conditional formatting on 20 layouts. So I said, coincidentally, that came up, and I'm like, okay, I can do that dry on the field schema level, right? Rather than adjusting 20 fields, right? Makes sense. And then it was interesting because that was coincidental to the bug that was widely reported, pertaining to the conditional formatting, duking it out with placeholder text, which they're going to patch in the next version. But, and I generously contributed a blog post to FM Soup to search for conditional formatting.
And about the issue with the collapsed script steps?
Like if you try and move them around or something?
Yeah, if you move them around, you're going to lose their content. The descendant items disappear, and what happens is the one you move inherits whatever is directly above it. It's goofy.
So, yeah,
cool.
I mean, it's so just be testing it. You know what I mean? Just don't break. It doesn't serve anyone's good. It doesn't help anyone at all if you break stuff on your customer's install. So that, Dennis, your point, it was brave of you to say it. It's like you got to really get the hang of what's going on before you roll it out to a customer who's just going to get pissed off if something like that happens.
And Tony, what you said earlier tonight about layouts, in working with this full access to go app, it got me so pissed off. I actually submitted something to ETS about it. And this goes back years. In your preferences, there's an item that says save layout changes automatically, parentheses, do not ask. Well, yep. I expect that to, respect that preference setting. However, if I am looking at a list view and I happen to decide I want to look at it for a moment in layout view, I'm prompted, do you want to make this change with the layout? Well, I haven't really made a change yet, so I always wonder, what the heck are they talking about with this change? And what I found out is that this change means that it's changing the default view of your layout setup. So I have to constantly make sure that I'm choosing no when I do that. But if I'm in
anybody who
layout,
has access to edit that layout gets the same message.
right. And if I am in the table view and I decide to make a column wider or add a field, it again prompts me, do you want to make this change with the layout? And because I do want that change to be saved, I have to then go back to layout setup and undo the default having been changed to table view. And in my case, with this app that we're doing for the conference, I'm not the only developer in it. So I have to be especially careful that other people are not accidentally changing the default view of a layout, or else my little pop-up windows, will go to the wrong view.
So let me ask a question for the consortium here, or the group. If Dennis, if I'm understanding what you're saying, there's a setting for any given layout, there's a choice: view as form, view as list, view as table.
Right.
Okay. Here's what I started to do, and others might do different. I'm kind of curious what people have to say. Because a user can change something, like I might have a lovely list view and they decide to change it to form, and then I get a help ticket, which I don't want to get. So I've taken the trouble to, say this is of this, and I just deselect two of them. And Dan, this would be, I tried to script the user interface on that. Not easy. Like I wanted to be able to toggle through a list of layouts and just go click, 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 click. But once it's done, it's done. So long story short, if I think it's a form layout, it's going to be a form layout to the end of time. Likewise for list and table, and all kinds of problems go away.
Right. It's more work, as you say. And
polish.
When I raised my hand as a volunteer to build this app, I just didn't want to take on, that volume of work.
This is weird.
You can spend you can build an app and it works, and then you can polish it and spend the same amount of time.
Right.
Tony, I'm going to post in the chat a link of a bunch of functions for UI scripting FileMaker. Now, I can't guarantee how up to date they are. This is my fork of something from a place I used to work that was just like kind of like they posted it all online and made it open. But it's like a bunch of pieces. It's got like stuff about managing windows, manage security, manage layouts, manage custom functions. So it might give you some hints on like some tricks for some of that stuff. Although again, they've changed some of those interfaces, so it might be out of date.
Yeah, we were Dan and I were talking a little bit offline, just about user interface. And while we love the FileMaker platform, that got recorded, right, Eric?
Still recording.
We love it so much that we are willing occasionally to provide honest feedback on things that would make it even more wonderful.
And to talk for hours on it at a user group meeting.
What's that?
And to talk hours and hours about it at a user group meeting.
Well, anyway, kind of joking. There's a number of things in the user interface that are a little bit difficult to, and Dan was saying, and kept it to the bread and butter aspects, but there's some hooks into the user interface would be useful. Like you can't programmatically, pick a color or something like that. There's still some things that you can't convert into a keystroke.
I wish Heather Winkle would come back.
What was that?
I said, I wish Heather Winkle would come back, because she was responsible for everything that we saw for the first time in version 12.
She worked with the programmers for the layout. What was 12? That was themes and styles began in 12 and 13.
Right.
The new layout surface.
Right.
Right.
She came from Adobe.
She came from Adobe, and she brought all those that graphic stuff to things. So, and then she left, and it was like we needed her to stay.
She presented what, Eric, about a year ago here?
Yeah. No, this year.
That's right. What was she with Delta Airlines now?
Yeah. doing mostly AI related stuff. Well, and I'm sure she's doing a lot of other things, but yeah, that was the presentation.
Oh, Delta just came out with variable pricing. We should ask her if she's doing that. They're doing some sort of like Uber pricing or like, I don't know. It was like they try and make an effort to figure out how much you can pay.
As long as they don't have Uber pilots.
What is Uber? Oh, yeah. Uber's doing better these days. I don't think it's losing money anymore. So the UI stuff, let's see,
Yeah, I'm
I'll
gonna
have
share. I'm posting a chat. My back when I don't know if they're still looking at these, but in the community they had like a product ideas section. So I've got
Okay.
some that I posted about 8 years ago.
So what's top of your list now?
Well, to make relationship graphic accessible, we talked about that. Menu item for every command. I would so love if, no matter, I don't care how nested deep they are, if there was a menu item for everything you can do in layout mode or in any other interface, so that you could, like, oh, the coordinates for the thing, the top coordinate, if that had a menu item and that brought up a little dialogue where you could type in a number, because then you could automate this stuff, or you could add like tools and you wouldn't be clicking these fiddly little palettes with little tiny boxes with numbers in them, that if you click in them, now you're not clicked in your layout anymore, and then you're typing something and wondering why nothing's happening. Oh, it's because you're in the little number box for the top coordinate, and these little palettes, everybody loves palettes everywhere. um, I love menus because I think palettes are a great shortcut that's very visual and people can see it, but commands should be in the menus on a Mac. Not about Windows. I'm not going to argue about Windows users. They got
I
their own
would wonder
interface.
if you'd run out of keystrokes, like if it was
No. You don't need keyboard shortcuts. I'm saying they should have
menu.
menu items. Yeah, menu
Okay.
items, not menu shortcuts. Because then you could do things like, if people want to, they could. You can Apple script menu items very definitely, and they don't move
Well, it would be,
around.
so what would be the like a primary use case, like number one? I mean, I'll give you my number one, which would be, just getting into the object name.
Yeah, sure. Rename the object. Clicking over you got to click on the inspector, then get to the first tab, then click in there. And then the other thing you've got is some of those little text boxes. If you type in them,
Yeah. Oh,
they don't always save. If you don't do it right, they don't save. And
okay.
the thing that you put in there evaporates. And then you're wondering why something doesn't work. Oh,
Okay.
give me a little modal dialog box that pops up that when you type something and hit return, it's done and it's saved and it's part of the object now. Anyway, another
If you
weird
go to
one.
add a field to a layout and you click on the little icon that is a database icon, and it takes you into Manage Database, where you can add the name of the field that you're trying to add to a layout. So it's a new field. What gets put on the layout is whatever was the previous field.
Oh.
And I remember showing that to Robert Halsey many years ago, but it's still the same.
Oh, that's weird. I don't know if I've ever added a field that way.
What was the what was the feature?
You're using the field picker to put a field on a layout.
Right.
And you realize the field doesn't exist yet in your list of fields. So you click the little icon for the database in the lower right corner, and that takes you into Manage Database, where you can now create a field. And you would think that that field that you've just created would be the one that gets put on the layout, but it's not.
Okay, I see.
It exists, but you got to go pick it again manually.
Yeah, the field picker, the process of having fields that are defined and then putting them on the layout, that's, Dan, what you were doing, I saw like you were automating what looked to me to be some of the tasks that we do the most. You know what I mean? And I like the visibility, and then the layout fields to script steps. There's a ton of stuff to do, but if you automate the 80 to 90% you do the most, the loop script, super popular. Do you do anything for dialogues?
I don't know. I think I often just go and copy them or whatever.
Yeah. Do you have any sense how many people are using your tools?
Not off the
Other
top of
than
my
the Matt
head.
Petrosky video? I mean, we know, I mean, the fact you got a video, but there's obviously people, I'm going to guess people using your tools without using a video.
There are on GitHub, it's got 35 stars. I guess that means 35 people are, who have GitHub accounts are paying attention to it. I think more people
those are
than
the
that
people
use
who
it.
are like following, who have it bookmarked as
Yeah,
like,
essentially they're like, hey, I want
they'll
to
get
keep
a
a track
ping,
of this
they'll get a
project.
ping if you do something.
That would be watching it. There's 13 of those.
Okay.
Including me. There's 12 forks. So 12 different people have like their own fork of it, which means they can make their own independent changes. Like Matt, for example, when Matt did that pull request, because he has his own fork, and he's saying, hey, I'd like to contribute back my improvements. And so I need to merge
right.
those.
You could merge the branch or whatever.
Yeah.
Assuming it's good. That's kind of cool. So
good.
wait, 12 people have given you like pull requests in the form of a GitHub fork?
No. They've got forks. They haven't necessarily asked me to do anything about it.
Oh, they've taken your code and gone in a slightly different direction?
Yeah, or they just wanted to have their own copy in case something happens to me,
Oh, okay. Good. That makes sense. Interesting. Hey, David Simpson, you mentioned a little while ago you're working on a tool. Wow. Is that a secret project or is that something?
It's not a secret project. It's something I'm going to be having available at full access, and it's called the FM Pro Clipboard Explorer, and it's a little bit of cross-platform tool. A little bit more of a kind of a low level than what you're showing here. Just showing you all the objects, and you would be able to put literally multiple object types, on the clipboard at the same time if you wanted to, because it'll have a little data store. It's written in live code, and so I have to add maybe update maybe a dozen lines of code for Windows, make sure I got those data types correct. But I'll be working on that when I get back from the farm next week.
So David, if you put, and this is maybe a question for Dan also, if you put multiple objects on the clipboard at the same time, can you then intelligently pull them out in a sequence that matches the sequence that's required to get the dependencies right? Like in other words, just repeating from earlier, if you put multiple objects, meaning a custom function, a script, and a button, can you then, just say, hey, put them all where they should go and do it in the correct sequence?
Well, you'd have to go to custom functions, paste, close that, go to the other thing, paste. You wouldn't have to copy again. You could just go to the place, paste.
Oh, that's interesting.
Paste.
So you load the clipboard with multiple objects and it would paste the appropriate object.
When you paste, it'll,
I like that.
Custom functions, managed custom functions would know, I can't take the script steps out of the clipboard. I better take the custom functions.
Right.
So that's an efficient workflow. I go by the rule, count the clicks. You know what I mean?
It could save clicks.
That's fewer clicks because you load the clipboard once, and then you traverse the FileMaker modal interface and go to the appropriate places.
And you could potentially Apple script that stuff too. So.
Well, you could also have it be like, copy it and have a little dollar come and go here first, and then when it pastes, you could tell it. Like, in other words, you could bundle up for any given feature. Like I moved to a customer file the other day. I had built a pretty decent multi-select functionality, which is kind of timely because the list of record IDs feature that came out pairs well with the multi-select feature, which is not built into the platform, but it's bread and butter. I think Vince Manano or someone over at Beeswax did a blog post on multi-select. Anyway, long story short, to implement the multi-select, I have to bundle up a collection of FileMaker objects. So what I learned today is I could do that in one object, copy it, and then go bang, bang, bang. And I could have little Apple script saying, go, good, go here next, go here, go here, go here. That's cool.
Right, yeah, you could definitely do that.